Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about the 458 Socom cartridge. Now this is actually a viewer request video, and we're going to discuss it in kind of my standard cartridge discussion format. So we're going to go over history, talk about some data as well as some contextual data that goes along with that, do a little bit of cartridge comparison, and then round it out with kind of where I think the cartridge's best application is overall. Now for the history portion of this, there was, many years ago, post 1993, but prior to 2001, there was a barbecue in which a couple of designers, cartridge designers, ran into some veterans of Operation Gothic Serpent. Now, for those of you who don't know, Operation Gothic Serpent is the name of the operation that is depicted in the movie Black Hawk Down. So the Battle of Mogadishu and all those types of things. And what these designers got out of that conversation overall was that some of the Special Operations Command operators that were a part of that conflict were unhappy with the performance of the 5.56 cartridge. They found the M855 was not effectively one-shot stopping anybody, that it was taking multiple rounds to be able to put down enemy assailants. And these two designers, named Marty Tareem and Teppo Jutsu, decided that Socom needed something better. It's not exactly that the United States government approached them and said, hey, we want you to design a more powerful cartridge for the AR-15 platform, as much as they decided to undertake this process on their own. Now, what they would decide to do was design a cartridge that would fit the most potent cartridge that they could, that would fit into the AR-15 platform. Still be able to utilize AR-15 magazines and then also be readily adaptable to suppressor use. So what they would wind up designing was that they would take a 50 Action Express cartridge case, lengthen it a little bit, and then also neck it down to .458 caliber, which would allow them to be able to use 45-70 projectiles. They would initially mount it with a 300 grain projectile. However, they could move up to a 500 grain projectile. The 300 grain projectile would be moving at roughly 2,000 feet per second, generating 2,400 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. That is a stout cartridge right there. And really, it's not the last cartridge, most powerful cartridge that you can cram into an AR-15 to be designed, but it's definitely the first, and honestly, kind of a little bit of bottom line up front, it's one of the more successful to achieve this process. Now, the initial rifle manufacture would actually be undertaken by a company called Tromix, and ammunition manufacturing would be covered by a company called Southern Ballistics Research. Now, let's go ahead and cover a little bit of the kind of data-driven aspect of this. So the cartridge would come out in 2001, and if you take a look at this chart here that I got off of a app called Ballistic AE, you can see that the cartridge has a definite rainbow-like trajectory, and that between energy as well as bullet drop, you're looking at about a 225 to maybe 275 yard cartridge with a 25 yard zero. At 300 yards, the cartridge drops about 51 inches. Now, to put that into a little bit of context, I'm 5'10". If you were to hold center mass on me standing out in the middle of a field, apparently not worried about getting shot at, you would wind up impacting between my feet at best, possibly shooting me in the foot based off of that ballistic drop. So that kind of tells you where this cartridge is going to be effectively used in that shorter overall distance. Not much past 200 yards, to be completely honest. Anything just under 300 is going to be kind of optimistic overall. However, it's still at 1,000 foot-pounds of energy at about that drop distance, in that 250, right around 250 yard range. It's still at 1,000 foot-pounds of energy, which puts it at enough power to be able to drop most North American big game. And consider that this cartridge was initially designed to shoot at humans. That's pretty good overall. Now, a lot of times this cartridge is stated as being a semi-automatic 45-70, so let's go ahead and do a little bit of comparison with that. Now, the cartridge that we used was a 300 grain projectile for the 458. Let's utilize a 325 grain Hornady Lever Evolution bullet. Now, I picked this one specifically because it was fairly close in grainage to what we'd already identified with the 458 Socom, as well as also being a ballistic tip bullet, which is going to give us a better dynamic with a flat shooting trajectory in the 45-70. The best dynamic we can get, at least. As we can see here, 45-70 is actually generating more energy at the muzzle at just over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. And its drop, though very comparable, is at least getting to a little bit further past 250. However, it's still not quite a 300-yard gun. It's still a lot of drop to try to account for, depending on what it is that you're doing. I would say that the 458 Socom represents the 4570 very well. I wouldn't call it a one-for-one swap. However, the great thing about it being a .458 diameter bullet is that you can use a lot of 4570 projectiles, which gives you a wider range of options whenever you're hand loading, as well as manufacturers an opportunity to have a wider bullet selection overall. That's kind of cool overall, especially when you're trying to get to those higher ranges like the 500. Now, the 500 grain 458 Socom is moving at about 1,000 feet per second, which makes it readily adaptable for suppressor use and kind of that drive, that early on drive towards movie quiet suppressor use, which we'll talk about that more once we get along here in just a little bit. Now, the contextual aspect of this. Did the 458 Socom meet all of its goals? Well, actually, surprisingly so, but there's a couple things we got to talk about with the pursuit of these goals. So, quite a few times in the development history of the AR-15, manufacturers have tried different applications of interchangeable calibers, being able to just swap out uppers. And you hear a lot of people say that, well, I can just swap out an upper and then, bam, I've got a whole other cartridge. I got a whole other adaptability out of it. And there is a certain amount of interest in that from a civilian sector, in my opinion. Now, I don't particularly care to swap out uppers because to me it feels like only really having one gun at any time, where you might trick yourself into believing that you have more than one option, but ultimately you've only got, if you only have one lower and a whole bunch of uppers at any one time, you only have one gun. You can't just up and flex back and forth as easily as you might think. There's a lot of things that go along with that. Now, focusing primarily on Socom use of interchangeable uppers, and the same type of thing was attempted with the SOP Mod 2 program, and it didn't really work out the way it was projected overall. So, let's say you're planning for a mission, right? And there's going to be one section of the mission that requires suppression or really heavy caliber hard-hitting capabilities. But everything before that is going to be better handled with, say, intermediate cartridges that are going to be able to better obtain long-range capability or longer range capability, perhaps shots out to 300 instead of dealing with around that 250. That becomes an issue, especially if there's a lot of movement involved, with having two totally different uppers. It starts to become not exactly the best advantage overall, especially when you consider that an upper can be quite heavy, especially when you consider optic, light, any type of IR type uses and all that kind of stuff. And if you've got to find a space for that in your backpack, along with sustainment or perhaps equipment, snivel gear, batteries, any of those types of things, it's going to wind up taking up a lot of that space, let alone if you had a dedicated suppressor for that setup, a 46 caliber suppressor, which may not necessarily give you the best use with an intermediate cartridge when it comes to suppression. There's a lot of trade-off that has to be taken into account there that may not be as successful as you might think. This really starts to funnel the 458 Socom into a very niche requirement to where all of the mission is expected to take place at close range. However long that duration may be, all the mission's going to occur at close range. That's kind of what that winds up running it into. And specifically at that point, looking at the suppressor type use as well, your quiet has to all happen within those close distances. Not saying that it doesn't, I'm just saying that once you start getting so niche in a requirement, it becomes really easy to justify utilizing something else that is perhaps a little bit more well-rounded, perhaps a little bit more of a jack of all trades instead of just the master of one, as the 458 Socom kind of leverages itself into. And there's a certain amount, especially when you're doing complex missions and all that kind of stuff, there's a certain amount of transparency that you want in your systems. You don't want to have to constantly trade back and forth and rethink holdovers and all that kind of stuff. You want things to be as streamlined as you can. Even for myself, I train and I shoot a lot of different weapons platforms. I still try to identify things practices that I can utilize across all the weapons platforms so that whenever I switch out, if I have to do so, under pressure and all that kind of stuff, I don't run into a fumble to where I'm trying to operate an AK when I have an AR in my hands, or I'm trying to operate a semi-automatic pistol like a revolver. There's some things that you got to take in mind overall. Now, in addition to that, the magazines aspect. Now, the 458 Socom fits perfectly into Stanag magazines. However, there's an issue, and that's diminished capacity because they are drastically bigger rounds than a 5.56. So where you would have a 30-round 5.56 magazine, you would have a 9 or 10-round 458 Socom magazine at that point. Now, you can go ahead and unload that 30-round magazine and pop in a whole bunch of those 458 Socoms. They'll fit in just fine. Now you'll get better reliability and longevity out of a purpose-built 458 Socom follower in those magazines, but you can press Stanag magazines, out of your kit into 458 Socom magazines very well. However, there's a couple things that go along with that. If you're going for having two different uppers on the same operation, you now have two different calibers in the same type of magazines on that same operation. So now it's not just a matter of popping two pins and swapping in a new upper. You have to unload that magazine, separate those magazines so you don't run the risk of loading the wrong magazine at the wrong time and potentially inducing a malfunction or anything along those lines. You can't have that happen, and that's something that's going to require a lot of time and effort, a lot of thinking, especially if you're potentially under pressure. That could really start to work against you. Now, in addition to that, the capacity type aspect. Again, we're talking about it from a tactical military standpoint. The average combat load is 210 rounds. That's 7 magazines of 5.56. In a 458 Socom, in order to be able to get that same capacity, you're talking about 21 magazines. That's a lot of magazines. That's a lot of space. That if you were carrying 5.56, you would have more ammunition for that same amount of space. And that also comes into a weight thing, because 458 Socom is drastically heavier than 5.56. So now we're again working in a negative aspect on the weight ratio in tactical situations. Another thing to kind of put it into context, so both personally and professionally, I run a triple mag pouch across the front of my kit, and then I have one magazine in the gun. So that is 120 rounds of 5.56 on hand with easily accessible magazines in my backpack should I need to refresh out of there. You switch that over to 458 Socom and 30 round magazines, loaded with 458 Socom, you've got at most 40 rounds. That's a pretty drastic difference. I've carried heavier hitting rounds in dynamic environments, and I was always keenly aware of the fact that my space and weight efficiency was not at the same level as everyone else who had an actual intermediate cartridge. Now, in a civilian type application, that may not be as big a deal. Having one lower and a whole bunch of different uppers and having the 458 Socom that you can flex to should the situation arise isn't a bad thing, that's for sure. It definitely gives you some flexibility, and if you're not worried about being able to have more than one gun at any one moment, it's not a big deal. Again, if you're not necessarily worried about capacity for your uses because, well, you've got plenty of magazines, the scenario doesn't drive you to need 210 rounds, perhaps that lower capacity is not a big deal. That's a very personal, individual choice. But I think these are the reasons that Socom didn't necessarily flock to the use of the 458 Socom cartridge, even though they named it after them. Now, for suppressor use, that 500 grain bullet, that's probably going to be pretty quiet. It's also going to be pretty short range, but it's probably going to be pretty quiet. And when you do impact that target at close range, it is going down. I don't think there's a question about that at all. But certain aspects of the 458 Socom kind of make me think of an older idea of how to utilize suppressors. That extreme pursuit of movie quiet suppression that I don't think is necessarily indicative of the actual tactical use of suppressors today, where a lot of times suppressors are still utilized with high velocity rounds because the major goal is to disguise the location and signature of the shot, not necessarily make it so that somebody doesn't hear the shot the next room over. That's not, that Hollywood thing is not necessarily reality. It's a very difficult reality to be able to maintain. So this is what caused early suppressor use to be highly paired with like 45 ACP, because it's a big slow bullet and it suppresses really easily. However, it's also relatively close range or shorter range, and as much as it's carrying a lot of energy, there's a couple of different aspects to fighting that don't necessarily only revolve around energy or velocity or any one aspect of ballistics as much as it's a holistic approach. So sometimes when you cut too much out of one thing, you start cutting away from a lot of your other capabilities. That's why extremism in any aspect, including ballistics, is not a good thing. So there's our kind of contextual type aspect to this. Let's go ahead and start talking about some other comparisons here. And what I want to compare this cartridge to is the 450 Bushmaster, because the 450 Bushmaster was actually built with a very similar overall concept. However, there was a different target audience. It wasn't necessarily Special Operations Command as much as it was the hunting market. Now, in this case, the 458 Socom was actually adapted specifically targeting hunters who lived in localities that required the only rifle cartridges that could be used for hunting would be straight-walled rifle cartridges. This would be places like, most recently, Ohio, also Indiana does this type of thing. And these hunters, some hunters, still want to be able to use the AR-15 platform because it's readily adaptable to optics and other types of applications that make it good for hunting. There is a sporting type application for the AR-15, even though other people would have you believe otherwise. So, the 450 Bushmaster straight-walled .452 diameter 45 caliber projectile cartridge was developed. Now, how well does it fit into the AR-15 platform as compared to the 458 Socom? Well, as much as it chambers into an AR-15 upper just fine, there are a couple of dynamics you have to keep in mind, and it primarily revolves around the magazines. Now, if you look at the ballistics chart yet again, you'll see that we're looking at a 200 to 300 grain, about 250-ish grain projectile, being able to utilize 45 long colt projectiles at .452 diameter. And you can kind of see that once again, we're looking at a just over 200-yard cartridge, be it both in drop as well as energy, around that 250 mark yet again. However, all three of these cartridges that we talked about so far, the .458, the 4570, or excuse me, the 458 Socom, the 4570, and the 450 Bushmaster, all have a relationship with shedding velocity in which they are doing so very drastically. And we can see that in the charts that we've looked over so far. But they're still delivering a lot of energy at these distances, and there's something to be said for that, especially if you're trying to use it as a hunting cartridge. The 450 Bushmaster is performing quite well in this case. But as I said, the issue becomes magazines. The 450 Bushmaster, being a little bit smaller than a 458 Socom, has a tendency to try to stagger in Stanag magazines, and what that winds up doing is putting a lot of pressure on the feed lips, which will cause them to spread and will start to induce malfunctions because they will auto-eject. So once you go to seat a magazine, you might wind up with like double feeds and stuff like that. And double feeds are a pretty drastic failure overall. So there becomes a definite lifespan associated with Stanag magazines with use in the 450 Bushmaster. So it doesn't adapt as readily to the AR-15 as the 458 Socom does. But what about price? Because price is a factor no matter how much we might chafe at the idea. So ammunition prices are subjective. They're constantly changing. However, the 450 Bushmaster is coming in between $1.50 and $2 a round, whereas 458 Socom is coming closer to $3 a round. So you could definitely shoot 450 Bushmaster more often or at a better cost evaluation. However, if you're primarily using these cartridges for hunting, you're not necessarily shooting them a whole lot. You'll do your initial 0, you might do a verification of 0 at the start of the season, and then just however many rounds for however many animals you take, especially since, of course, you're going to make ethical shots whenever it is that you're out there hunting. It should only take 1, maybe 2 rounds to put down an animal. Especially with the amount of energy these cartridges are putting out, they're perfectly capable of doing that. So, kind of take that in your overall evaluation of where a 458 Socom sits in the market overall. Now, what are my personal opinions on the use of the 458 Socom? Well, tactically, I think it's very niche. I think it'll do an excellent job of complicating somebody's body armor solution. However, some things that I would throw out about that is that body armor is not a get out of jail free card when it comes to energy. No matter what it is you're being shot at with, if it impacts your body armor, it's going to put you on your butt, and it's going to cause internal damage. Now, I would say that a 458 Socom with these larger projectiles that it's capable of launching is going to cause a significant amount of damage. It's still not necessarily going to result in somebody dead if they have the proper level of plates to be able to resist impact. Or penetration, I guess, would be the concern in this case. Somebody's still not going to be happy about it. They're not getting right back up. It's not Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, at a checkpoint to immobilize a vehicle's engine block or something like that, I think the 458 Socom has a definite excellent application. However, whenever we're talking about full power rifle cartridges, they have they're pretty effective at immobilizing vehicles, especially if you put enough hits into them. But if I need a purpose-driven weapon system for that, the 458 Socom does make a lot of sense. For suppressor type use, it does work very well, but I really think that in a lot of dynamic environments, the lower capacity is definitely an inhibitor for somebody who is military or perhaps a contractor of some sort and has the option to be able to utilize these weapon systems. I think those become very niche options that could be easily satisfied by other cartridges, especially when it comes to suppressor use, like the 300 Blackout. Different video for a different day, however. However, for personal use, I think the 458 Socom in a hunting environment has some excellent qualities, and I would highly recommend that overall. For personal defense, I guess it depends on what you're defending yourself against. If you're worried about animals, the 458 Socom is a pretty excellent option. If you're worried about the two-legged variety of varmint, it starts to become a little bit of a trade-off at that point. If you live in a heavily populated area, an apartment building, or a suburban type scenario, urban, those types of places where you have neighbors within sight, the 458 Socom is definitely going to have an over-penetration characteristic to it that could potentially turn your justified shoot into a homicide. However, if you live on a more open area where the only people who should be coming around uninvited are people who don't have the best intentions in mind, that would be an interesting choice overall, especially since in a home defense type scenario, 10 rounds is not nearly as limiting of a factor as it would be in a combat type scenario. So that is something to take into account overall when it comes to context. But really, 458 Socom, especially if you're taking closer range shots in like heavier brush, should be excellent for anything in North America. And I bet you, depending on laws of course, you could possibly flex it into Africa on perhaps some of the more dangerous game in those areas, especially since a lot of times that winds up being a little bit closer overall hunting. 4570 has been used on Cape buffalo before, so 458 Socom in theory could do the same kind of thing. Though, once you start hunting dangerous game, there's a real dynamic when it comes to power, and I could understand overkill being underrated in that case. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this cartridge overall. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and have a good day.